Tom, when you first introduced virtual reality to your audience, your My Big Toe readers, you often spoke about Nick Bostrom and his paper, Are We Living in a Computer Simulation? And currently, Elon Musk is also very much a proponent of virtual reality. Can you tell us the difference between Nick Bostrom's concept of virtual reality, Elon Musk's, and yours?
Sure. You know, some parts of it are similar. Obviously, we're living in a computed reality, living in a simulation. All that is the same. The difference is that in my theory, the computer is consciousness, is a larger conscious system. And we, the players, are individuated units of consciousness. And there's a purpose for that, which is an evolutionary purpose for the larger conscious system. So that develops a purpose of why it would be that way and what the reality was made for and its purpose and why we're here, kind of pulls all that together. Now, when Bostrom first came up with his idea that we are likely to be living in a virtual reality, he just used logic and probability to come to the conclusion that we almost certainly would be living in a virtual reality. Okay, and you can look up Bostrom on the internet and find out what his argument was. Now, when he came to that conclusion, the next thing to think of course, is, well, how is that the case? You know, how is it if we're in a virtual reality, that means there are players and there's a computer, and where are these players and computers? What could they possibly be? And like most people, they take what they know and project that into what they don't know. So what Bostrom and what Elon Musk did is they say, okay, it's likely we're in a virtual reality, so it must be that there's people just like us making virtual realities just like we do, except they're better at it than we are, they're more advanced than we are, and that we must be characters in their virtual reality. Well, then where would these people come from? Well, they could just be aliens who, you know, came from somewhere, but mostly what they propose is that those are us in the future. Humanity has progressed now in the future to a point where they are more sophisticated and make really, really good virtual realities. Okay? And that's what they've done. And because they have an interest in the past, they make a virtual reality that portrays their own past. And they say much as we do. In our virtual realities, we tend to have elves and barbarians and people with swords and so on. That obviously came out of our past, maybe, you know, what, in the Dark Ages or something. So we tend to go to the past to play our games, to set our games. Now, The Sims isn't that way. Sims doesn't necessarily return to the past. But anyway, that was their reasoning. So we are their ancestors, so to speak. These are people, these are the humans that have gone on, evolved, making this nifty game, and now they're playing past. They're playing, watch the people interact, you know, in our past. They come to that conclusion, like I say, because, I hate to say this, but it's because they really lack imagination. They are stuck with what they know. Here we are, we make virtual realities. If we're a virtual reality, then it must be us in the future, because you need more technology than we know. That puts us in the future, and we must be the subject, the characters in our future selves' virtual reality. And those with a little more imagination say, well, it doesn't have to be us in the future. It could be some alien race or some other kind of thing that's making this virtual reality just for its own amusement. Well, again, it seems like that's maybe a little more imaginative and it's aliens, but it's really the same thing. It's taking us. It's taking, you know, something like us that is doing this. Whether it's things that evolved on this planet or not, it's kind of irrelevant. It's the same idea. The failure of that idea is that it doesn't account for consciousness.
May I just point out something here, that the reason that you have discovered that consciousness is the computer is because you are a consciousness researcher. And your My Big Toe, your big theory of everything, began as a theory of consciousness. And that is because you are uniquely qualified in that you understand not only our physics, but you understand consciousness exploration as you have explored outside of this physical reality. So that is the thing that qualifies you to make these statements.
Yeah,
I think the one thing that they're missing, they cannot experience consciousness as you have, and therefore cannot make that part of their theory. I know one of the things they've suggested is how to hack our way out of our virtual reality. But I think you could speak to that a little better.
You see, the problem that they have is that, okay, these advanced people are making a virtual reality and we are the avatars, but yet we're conscious. You see, they don't have a consciousness playing us. Well, that's not the way virtual realities work. You see, there's a logical flaw there. A virtual reality has a player, a consciousness that plays an avatar, and the avatar is just a computed picture on a screen. It's just information. The avatar doesn't really exist. The elf in World of Warcraft doesn't really exist, you see. It's just a picture that looks like an elf running around on the screen because the player made the choice to run around, you see. So that's a logical part of a virtual reality. You need a player and a computer. Well, they have the computer. Oh, it's our advanced, civilization has now nifty computers and they can do this. But they have us, the avatars, being conscious. Avatars can't be conscious in a virtual reality. Avatars are just ones and zeros in a computer. They're computed things. A computed thing doesn't have consciousness, doesn't think, doesn't make choices. You see, that elf doesn't make all his own choices. That elf is, again, it's just something that looks like a man with pointy ears. That's the elf, a picture. So here we are now avatars in this virtual reality, yet we have independent consciousness. They've ignored and left out the logic of the virtual reality. Virtual realities don't work like that. They can't work like that. How can these people be playing us when we are making the choices? Okay. Now, one could say, well, we don't have free will. We don't make any choices. We don't have consciousness. They're playing us. Well, now, everything, that we do. Well, that means that they play us down to the minutia, the trivial details of being asleep, of going to the bathroom, of washing our socks, of, you name it. All of the things that we do in life that really aren't that interesting to somebody who's playing a virtual reality game. Matter of fact, most of our life is taken up with that. So they're going to play us while we sit in an office and do paperwork all day. Doesn't sound like a very interesting game, does it? You see, that's not going to work. The only way that the virtual reality can work is if you have a consciousness that is immersed and therefore believes that it is the avatar, because it's immersed in that avatar's experience. You see, the only data that player gets is data that is generated by the computer, which is what the avatar senses according to the rule set, what the avatar sees, what the avatar hears, what the avatar smells and feels. That's the only data this player gets. that's an immersive game. And in that game, the player thinks he is the avatar because that's the only experience he gets. But it's an individuated unit of consciousness, you see. Now, if we had the video games like we play, like World of Warcraft, where you can put it on pause, go make a sandwich, go take a bathroom break, and then come back, well, that won't work for this game where we are. You see, in the World of Warcraft, if you take a break and go eat a sandwich, the action doesn't stop. When you come back to World of Warcraft 15 minutes later with your sandwich, things have changed. Forces have changed on the ground. People that used to be standing next to you talking to you are in some other part of the map now because they're still playing. You took a break. You see, so if we were consciousness playing us like we play a game, then our players would want to go make a sandwich and take a break and do those kinds of things. And when they came back, suddenly everything would be different. Everybody that was in this house with us would disappear. They wouldn't be here anymore. And we don't experience that kind of thing. You see, we don't have these periods of lapse and then start up again like you do in a virtual reality like the World of Warcraft. Okay, but that's because we are the consciousness for that elf. That's a difference between that virtual reality and our virtual reality. In our virtual reality, we are the consciousness and we are immersed in it 100%. We take no breaks. We begin to believe that we are that avatar because we get no other data from any source other than that. Okay, that is what makes this game workable. So if that's the case, and these future relatives of ours are playing us, then they've got a lot of dreary moments while we sit on the toilet. They've got a lot of dreary moments while we do paperwork. They got a lot of dreary moments, while we're, having the flu or whatever else we do. That is really not all that interesting. If we are really avatars that are computed in a virtual reality, we can't be conscious. Some people are going to object to the concept of avatars not being able to be conscious. Some people will think, well, if a computer can be conscious, then why can't the avatars be conscious? After all, if the computer is conscious, the computer can just take a little bit of its processing and memory and divide that off for each avatar, and then that avatar would have its own little consciousness. Well, that doesn't work, and here's why. It is true that the avatar will indeed be conscious just like a computer would be conscious. The two of them will have the exact same kind of consciousness, and that is that both of them will be avatars, ones and zeros, unconscious, played by a consciousness from the larger conscious system, played by an individuated unit of consciousness. In a virtual reality, you always have the player as the consciousness. The avatar just responds to the player. It has to be that way. Always you have the player has to be in a non-physical frame relative to the avatar. These are just the way virtual realities are. You see, that conscious computer doesn't have its own organic consciousness that's been programmed. You can't program consciousness. We don't get our consciousness from a brain. That's the materialistic viewpoint, and that's what is confusing people. So it's this materialistic viewpoint that says the brain creates consciousness, therefore a computer can create consciousness because the computer can emulate the brain. Well, the brain does not create consciousness, nor can a computer create consciousness. The way you get a conscious computer isn't by very cleverly designing in consciousness. You provide an environment in which a character, an avatar, the computer itself, you see as an avatar. The computer is just in a different body than ours. We're an avatar and we get this carbon-based flesh and blood body, and the computer is silicon-based perhaps, and it gets, its little metal and, and components body. Both are virtual. It's a virtual computer, just like it's a virtual avatar. That virtual computer can, if it has an avatar that, if it's playing, or if it is itself being an avatar that has free will. Now, free will does not mean that you can have anything you want. Sometimes people say, well, I obviously don't have free will because if I did, I'd be rich and famous. That's not what free will is about. Free will is nothing more than the ability to make a choice. Free will isn't about getting everything you want. Free will is simply the ability to choose from the possibilities that you're aware of. So if you're aware that you could choose A, B, or C, you have the free will to choose A or B or C. That's free will, nothing more. So if a computer has software and hardware such that it supports a free will choice, and that is basically that the computer can choose whether it's going to do A, B, or C. And it can freely choose that. It's not algorithmic. It's not if this and that, then C. See, that's not choosing C. That's an algorithm. It has to be able to choose freely among the possibilities. If it can do that, if its software is non-algorithmic, and if it has these choices that are interesting for a consciousness to play, in other words, interesting, would attract a player would like to play those choices, then an individuated unit of consciousness will log on to this physical reality that is really a virtual reality, will log on to that virtual reality and play that computer. So a computer's consciousness is still an IUOC from the larger consciousness system. It's not something that's organic to the software and hardware. You see? So, yes, if in a computer you have a simulation, and that simulation that the computer is running has avatars, characters, elves and maybe humans and wizards and other things, and if those humans and wizards and other things make choices, okay, interesting choices, then a consciousness can log in to make those choices. Now you see all the choices presented by the simulation, a consciousness will make with free will. These choices have to be choices for which there is no determined or algorithmic answer. When we, as consciousness, play our avatars, these bodies, almost all the important choices we make, we don't have enough information to make a logical deduction for the choice. We can't make deductive choices because we just don't have enough information. We only have enough information if the choice is trivial. Very, very simple. Because in real life here, in this virtual reality, which is real life, most of our important choices are very complex with lots of variables and lots of things that we don't understand, lots of loose possibilities. So we understand how a conscious computer works. It works just like we do, where the computer is a virtual avatar. The computer has no consciousness, like my body has no consciousness. Both the computer, if it's conscious, and like my body, are being played by a consciousness, an individuated unit of consciousness. So you see, we're right back at the same spot again. Here we are, and we're going to try to justify why an avatar could be indeed conscious. But you see, consciousness doesn't work like that. The avatar, any avatar in a simulation, if it appears to be, let's say it this way, if it appears to be making free will choices, that's because there is an IUOC from the larger consciousness system making those choices. So this idea that we could be conscious avatars, see, that's an oxymoron. There are no conscious avatars. So the concept that we are conscious avatars is just illogical. It can't happen. All consciousness comes from the larger consciousness system. That's fundamental. There is no way to build consciousness. There's only a way to build a platform that consciousness finds attractive to play. And then you'll get a player, an IUOC, individuated unit of consciousness, to make those choices. And you might say, well, how does the player actually log on? What's the process here? How does it do that? Well, it's a virtual computer and a virtual body, avatar. It's all virtual. It's all being computed by the larger consciousness system. You see, the larger consciousness system is the creator of all of it. And the larger consciousness system provides all the consciousness that plays in the terms of individuated units of consciousness. So the logging on is easy. The body, your body and my body, is just a virtual body created by the larger consciousness system. And an individuated unit of consciousness is also a part of the larger consciousness system. There is no problem in logging on. It's all part of the same system. So it just isn't logical to think that an avatar can also be conscious. So if we are in a virtual reality, our consciousness must be someplace else, not in this virtual reality. The avatar cannot make its own consciousness any more than our brain can make its own consciousness. This is a virtual brain in a virtual universe. And virtual means it's computed. That it's computed means that it's just the result of a bunch of calculations. The result of a bunch of calculations does not create consciousness. So if we look at this if we try to look at this from both perspectives, if you say, well, let's look at it from a material perspective. Okay, we're going to look at it from a material perspective and we're going to say, oh, the brain does compute consciousness. And a computer can compute consciousness. That would be a material perspective. But now we're talking about a virtual reality. You see, in a virtual reality, we don't have a materialist creation. We have a computed creation. You see, so the problem with an avatar having organic, innate consciousness that it creates, that belongs to it, that's a part of its brain, is that you're having a materialist assumption that the brain can create consciousness. That's a material assumption. But you're placing that material assumption inside a virtual reality that is simply computed. You see, that's mixing and matching, your assumptions, and you can't have both. It's either a virtual reality, and it's not material, and avatars can't create consciousness because they're just ones and zeros, computations, or it's a material reality where brains create consciousness, and it's not at all virtual. You can't have a virtual reality where the avatars have virtual brains that create consciousness. It's an oxymoron. It's impossible. It's irrational and illogical. It's just difficult for materialists, even materialists that think virtual reality is a great idea. They're still materialists. They still have that materialist understanding and worldview. Even though they're stretching a little bit to the virtual reality, that materialist worldview has them creating conscious avatars where their virtual brains are creating consciousness. So where is this consciousness that we have 24/7, dreaming, awake, all the minor things we do in life, all the details? How would they do that? Well, our future humans aren't going to do that. You have to be immersed to do that, to play that kind of a game. And the avatars cannot be conscious on their own because they're computed characters. Now they can look like they're conscious, just like in a movie. If you look at the movie star up on the big silver screen, and the movie star is singing a song or doing a dance, and they look like they're conscious, but they're not. They're just an image. They're an image that's light bouncing off a screen. That image bouncing off the screen is not really conscious. It's just a record of something that a consciousness did. You see, it's like that. It's that same sort of thing. But we are conscious. We do make choices. That's very self-evident. And that means that we are consciousness. Consciousness must be the computer. We must be individuated units of consciousness. And this virtual reality, our bodies are just a computed avatar. You see, so that's why the idea that it's some alien force or our future humans that are doing this just doesn't make any sense. But that's not what Bostrom said. His argument, his logical argument, wasn't that it had to be future humans or even aliens. He just made that up as a guess at how it could possibly happen. His logic said it's very likely that this is a virtual reality. And he's right there. It is very likely that this is a virtual reality. And with little imagination, other than to just paste ourselves into all the roles, you see, well, here we're here, and now we're the future selves that are there, or we're the aliens, that are more advanced and they're there. It's all just basically taking ourselves to play all the roles because we don't have any more imagination than that. Well, it's not like that. The thing that's fundamental isn't this physical reality. You see, all those other ideas are stuck to materialism. It's a material reality. It's our future humans in their material reality who are computing us in their material computer, but they also have material needs and need that sandwich and potty break, you see, because it's a material reality. And those aliens, well, they're material aliens that come from an older part of the universe, so they're more advanced. Well, they need potty breaks too, you see. They're physical. They can't get immersed in us like obviously they would have to be for this reality to be the way it is. So if you start with an assumption that if this is a virtual reality, it has to be computed by physical people someplace, somehow, for some reason, then you end up coming up with goofy things like future humans and aliens. But if you realize the simple thing is that what makes us unique is our consciousness. We're conscious. You don't need to just copy and paste materialism everywhere to answer the question. We are consciousness. And once you come to that conclusion, a whole lot of things fall into place. Things that were paradoxical, things that didn't make any sense. Suddenly you can explain all sorts of things like lucid dreams, like all the paranormal things, telepathic conversations, the fact that people can heal with their minds, the fact that there's a placebo effect. All of these things then that are just kind of amazing things that seem to happen, but nobody knows how. That's why they're paranormal, because you can't explain them with materialism. All of these things then make sense. Okay. Also, the fundamentals of philosophy and theology about what's important in life, about doing good is a better thing than doing evil, morality, all of that makes sense. Besides, this game, this virtual reality game, now has a purpose. Whereas before it was just entertainment for future humans. Well, it's not very entertaining, you know, to watch me brush my teeth in the morning. That's not really high-level entertainment. Or even to be the consciousness that, you know, stands there and, you know, brushes each tooth, you know, that's not very entertaining either. So there's a purpose here, and that this is a trainer for the evolution of consciousness. You also can do better physics. So when you start with consciousness as what's fundamental, our reality is a subset of that. You also can understand why particles ought to be probability distributions. That makes sense. And you can change quantum mechanics from a science that is non-intuitive. They call it non-intuitive and weird because logic can't give you the answers. You can't look at it and say, well, here's the logical flow, and that's why you get this answer. It can't work like that. All the answers are computed. And only when you say that material particles don't really exist, they're probability distributions, then you can compute the right answer. Well, that kind of takes material right out of materialism, doesn't it? All your particles aren't material at all. They're probability distributions. So that makes sense in a virtual reality where consciousness is the computer. So it does better physics, it does better philosophy, it does better neuroscience, it does better sociology, because in our reason for being here is to evolve the quality of our consciousness, and that means we need to evolve toward getting along, caring about each other, being cooperative, sharing. That's how you evolve the quality of your consciousness, which is another whole discussion, but you see it makes sense. So yes, back to the comments you had, if I hadn't spent 40 years exploring consciousness, I would have done just like they did. I would have guessed that, you know, copy and paste materialism and human sorts of things out as the puppeteers, as the people making the virtual reality and so on, because I wouldn't have had any other idea what to say. And that's where they are. I would have been in that same boat. But I did have 40 years exploring the larger consciousness system. I did understand how consciousness interacts with this reality. I did understand what I was here for, what the point of the reality was. And I understood a lot of those things, which made it obvious that consciousness was fundamental and the physical was derived, was computed, and that consciousness, therefore, is the computer. Because in a virtual reality, the thing that's most fundamental is the computer and the player, not the virtual reality. So yes, it was because of that experience of mine and that understanding of mine that I was able to take a different tack, come up with a different solution that lies entirely outside of materialism, because I'd already been there and done that and realized that materialism was not fundamental. So it fit my experience. Then it started to fit science, quantum mechanics, neuroscience, a lot of other things. There are these paradoxes that just don't make sense until you look at it from the perspective of a virtual reality where consciousness is a computer. And then it all makes sense. So that's how my virtual reality is very different from that Bostrom talked about. His first step was correct. It is very likely we're in a virtual reality. Then starting to hand wave and make up how that could possibly be, copying and pasting materialism everywhere, was the only thing they knew how to do. Everything else was too far outside the box. So that seems to be where most scientists are with their virtual reality concepts. Most scientists have something in the back of their mind that makes it all still material and physical. It's just that doesn't stand up logically. It doesn't answer the questions about consciousness. It doesn't help you do better quantum mechanics. It doesn't solve the problems in other fields as well. It doesn't, it just isn't as good a theory. So that's the main difference. So not only with my experiments am I trying to show that this is a virtual reality, but also that the computer is consciousness. Consciousness is what's fundamental. Because in these experiments, we're going to see where the reality, okay, that determines how the experiment turns out, has choices, and how they make those choices. So that's the second part of this, to make the idea that consciousness is the computer is really the only logical place to go after you've said, this is a virtual reality. Nothing else works. Nothing else is rational. Nothing else is logical.
Thank you, Tom, for explaining the distinctions between your concept of virtual reality and some of the other popular concepts that are out there.